do or should foundations support advocacy efforts, and what does that look like for the Gun Foundation?
It's really an issue of how do we take what we have to make more than what we've got. And for us, the single best way of doing that is leveraging the funds that we do have at our disposal and are so lucky to have at our disposal, to have an exponential benefit beyond the parameters of our own budget at the foundation. And the single best way of doing that is being able to leverage our funds with public investment, because then you're starting to talk about some real money, and being able to invest in problems both at their origin and potentially at scale. And again, those are things that are a little challenging for us to do at the foundation in isolation, or even in partnership with the many other wonderful philanthropic partners that we have in the community. So it's very much about a leveraging issue, first and foremost. But it's not just that. I mean, there's other things that we feel very passionately, and that is that there's actually a responsibility, both in the mission that we have at the foundation. Like many other foundations, we have this grand and glorious one-line mission that basically says, we're here to help save humanity. I mean, it's a little more tailored than that, but not much. It's just to go out and promote the welfare of humankind, basically, which is great because it gives us a lot of latitude. But for us, it also means that to do our best to live into that, to use a sort of tired analogy, we have a responsibility to use every tool in the box, and that direct service and working to ameliorate immediate need, of course, is a powerful, compelling imperative. I mean, we all want to do that, but if we only do that, we'd exhaust our budget and we'd never be able to meet the need anyway. So we feel that there's a responsibility to use every option on the table to expand our reach, and similarly feel that there's a sort of corresponding responsibility in the nonprofit sector to do the same, but that we want to be in a position to help nonprofits do that. So it's meeting your mission, living into your mission as fully as possible. And then the last thing I would say is that despite incredible myths and misunderstandings about the legal parameters of doing advocacy work, that the law and regulation is actually set up to help us do it. As a private foundation, we actually have a few more restrictions than other kinds of not-for-profit entities, but we know the parameters and we work through them and we work around them and we work up to the line. And we encourage nonprofits to do the same thing, because both the law and Internal Revenue Code is established in a way to facilitate your doing that. And we can talk more about that, but part of the reason we think it's so important is because we've been given the latitude to do it, and we should take advantage of it.
And John, I'll ask you the same question.
Sure.
Why do you think foundations should be participating in this? But I'll add the piece of how does that impact the work that you do at the center and
Sure.
and others.
Well, and I mean, I agree with Marcia that I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about what you can and can't do. And I think where some people get kind of tricked up is they confuse lobbying with advocacy. And advocacy is a much broader sort of concept. I mean, it covers a lot of things. And lobbying is usually pretty narrow. And the thing I've noticed is that this concept of advocacy and public policy work has really sort of permeated the nonprofit sector, which is really encouraging to me. Because there used to be like, one of the things I quote Marcia, when I first worked at Community Solutions, was she told me that she wanted as many people doing advocacy and lobbying on behalf of nonprofits as there were doing it for the corporate interests in town. And I think we're finally there. I think we have as many people.
Now we need to double it.
Yeah, now we need to double it. Now even because our voice and the voice of our clients and the people that we work with and represent needs to get heard at the table, and they often don't have a voice unless we help give them that voice and sometimes speak for them and with them. But I think when I think about it at Community Solutions, I think advocacy is a central part of our work. and it sort of permeates the history of the organization. I mean, from 102 years ago, we've been involved in advocacy and involved in public policy. I mean, the organization, people who are affiliated with our Council on Older Persons actually helped draft the first elder abuse law in the state of Ohio, worked on other things like that. We helped create the Urban League here in Cleveland and the Golden Age Centers. And so we've been involved in advocacy and policy since our beginning, and it's really a part of I see it as part of our mission. And one of the things I'm interested in, and why I'm so happy to see so many of you here today, is I want to sort of get more of that. I want to see more people involved in it. We want to help people do that, either through trainings like this or providing consultation and resources, so we can get more people to the table and get better results.
So, Marcia, I'm going to ask you if you could provide us a little bit of a background look at how some of the decisions of what you're going to fund, what types of advocacy activities you're going to fund happens within the foundation. The thinking about the juvenile system work that you do, the juvenile justice system work that you do, and the comprehensive school age health work that you do. How do some of those decisions get made within the foundation? And then, John, if you could talk a little bit about how that affects how you work with foundations like the Gun Foundation.
Great, well, thanks. Of course, the answer is there's not one answer. And there's a combination of things that I think wind up being more art than science, but I hope that I can put my finger on a few. So one is going to be obvious, and that is there's obviously something happening in the community that represents a compelling need that's less than fully addressed or perhaps is not well coordinated. We're seeing things pop up in various elements of the community, but somehow there's a need that is evident really across the community that would benefit from greater cohesion, greater public investment, or either new or reformed a statutory or regulatory framework. So the juvenile justice area that you mentioned, Carrie, was one of those. We had a set of state prisons for juveniles that were triple their rated space, meaning we had 3 times more youth, and those disproportionate number of them from Cuyahoga County that were coming back to this community and not remotely prepared to re-enter the community in a productive way for either themselves, their families, their neighborhoods, the community at large. And that was playing out in ways that we don't want. And so sometimes to move the needle, good, robust conversation and dialogue with public officials can help educate them and inform them. And sometimes, I hate to say it, but the only thing that will move the needle is litigation. And it's not, we don't get up in the morning looking to sue people, but there are moments where that sort of dramatic action is needed to actually reset the framing of an issue. And I raise that particular example to say, in that instance, really started with litigation, but it has since evolved to a much broader set of tools that John referenced, that we're now seeing advocacy take many, many shapes and form. Research analysis, communications elements, direct education and lobbying by folks impacted by the issue itself. So we can talk more about the different types of advocacy, but there is this, probably half the time it's because there's this obvious need that's somehow not being addressed, that the public policy arena could disproportionately benefit what we are hoping to see. The other is that the other big bucket of things is when you can see the tip of an iceberg, an emerging issue. And we are so unbelievably fortunate. I always say we're the most optimistic people in town because we are so lucky to sit in an intersection where we see all these incredible people and ideas and projects crossing our desks across all the areas that the foundation works in. And through that, sometimes you can see, wait a second, I can see 4 or 5 organizations are working on something that is a signal of a bigger challenge. And that if we could invest a way to coordinate and help organizations know about each other and do that's also very compelling. And that's where, at the moment, two very quick things. One is around reproductive health. We've had a 60-year history of being involved in reproductive health work with people in this audience. Thank you for all the work you've done. But we saw that there was a real lack of getting the most efficacious and effective contraception into the hands of low-income or particularly vulnerable young women. And so we're working on an initiative around long-acting reversible contraception that will make it affordable and accessible and able to be a good business model for providers. And we only learned about that by seeing a tip of an iceberg in a set of organizations. And then the second is what's happening around the consent decree and the urgent need around criminal justice reform. We see it so dramatically in this community through the tragic events we've all read and learned so much about, but it's also in our minds symptomatic of a larger need for systemic reforms in the criminal justice system. We're very lucky to partner with Center for Community Solutions on this, but it was a tip of an iceberg that reflects a deeper need. And so those are sort of the two big buckets.
So how do those conversations at foundations affect how you approach and work with them?
Well, I think something Marcia said is right, that iceberg, seeing the tip of the iceberg. I think the first thing we look for is at the right time. I always talk about the window opens for a short period of time, and you want to get as much through as you can, because in the policy world, the window isn't always going to be open. People change, leadership changes, and so you have these moments in time where you can really move policy. So I think the first thing to look for is sort of, is this the right time? Are the right people around the table, and are the right policymakers in place to help you move this forward? Then I think they want to see a plan. They want to see, here's what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, what's it based on? There are really evidence-based practices around advocacy, and a lot of folks from foundations have been in that world before, and so they know what those are, and so they look to see that those are reflected in your plan, that you've got a way of carrying it out. I think more and more they want to see, as Marcia said, that sort of element of a communications effort as part of it. We can't just be sort of talking to ourselves. We've got to talk to the broader world, or at least figure out what communication is going to impact the policymakers. I think they want to know that you understand what the process is. I joked earlier this week, I did an advocacy training. I wanted to show Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law, because sometimes it's just that basic stuff. You want to make sure that you know what that is.
And then show how it's not really the case.
Yeah, right. It's the secret Schoolhouse Rock.
That's right.
Right, that's where the contributors come in.
The real story.
And so I think they want to know that you understand the process, that you've got that communications piece, that you've got the right people involved, that you've got the capacity within your organization to do it. And if you don't have the capacity, are you partnering with somebody else? I think it makes a much stronger proposal when it's more than just you, more than just one organization trying to do this work. I think they're looking for ways that you kind of leverage, your skills and your resources with other organizations.
Do you mind if I just
Please.
mention? I think everything John said is absolutely 100% true in our experience. And it's interesting, when we were getting deeper into this, it wasn't like there were a whole bunch of tools out there to go pull off the shelf and say, this is how we're going to examine these requests, or this is how we're going to encourage these requests, et cetera, et cetera. So we actually had the really amazing experience of working with a team at the Alliance for Justice, which there's great resources in this field, but if you are not aware of the Alliance for Justice, I encourage you to do so, and go to their Boulder Advocacy webpage. And it's so easy to find. If you Google Alliance for Justice, or if you Google Boulder Advocacy, it pops right up. And there you'll find an amazing array of resources and tools. And there are certainly others, but they've done a beautiful job of putting a great set of materials in one place, including a project we worked with them on that basically creates an upfront checklist that assesses your advocacy capacity, and it's called the Advocacy Capacity Assessment. How's that for a really boring title? But ACT. And now it's free, and it's interactive, and it's available, and we use it in all different kinds of ways. And then there's a back-end tool for evaluating your advocacy work. But between the two, they're tremendous primers that can be adapted for your own use and use with your boards, for example, or staff. And we've just found that those kinds of tools are super helpful, both for us in review, but perhaps more importantly for our applicants and partners to prepare.
So those are both of those comments are really great segues to start talking about the nitty-gritty of it, to start talking about what nonprofits can do, what they can't do, and some of the things that you are, as a funder, are interested in seeing funders do. And John, maybe some perspective on what you see with some of your partners that are happening in the community.
In terms of specific things?
Yeah. What's advocacy and what's lobbying, and what are some of the activities that can be done as in advocacy?
Well, I mean, I guess I'd talk first about what lobbying is. Lobbying is around encouraging a legislative branch or an executive branch to take a specific action, to sort of vote for a specific bill, to implement a certain rule, and it can also extend to election activity. We know we can't do partisan election activity as a 501c3 organization, but we can do issue advocacy. So, for example, the Health and Human Services levy would be on the ballot next year, so nonprofit organizations are free to engage in advocacy around that, give money to that campaign, provide volunteers, do it during work. You can do all that stuff. That's all. You got to report it. It's considered grassroots lobbying, but it's all legal. Advocacy is a much broad. I mean, advocacy is producing the research to make the case for the policy that you want to pursue. It's writing the op-ed that's on Cleveland.com. It is organizing or mobilizing or educating your constituents. It could be doing a candidate forum during an election. It could be doing an issue forum. I mean, the breadth of what you can do is actually pretty broad. Although the thing I think is important about that when thinking about what you want to do is I think first starting at the beginning, what's the action that you want to cause to happen? What's the issue, the decision you want to have made? Who can make it? That's part of that thing that I think the foundations are going to look for. Is like, well, you know what you want to change, but you know who can change it, and then figure out from that what are the advocacies or strategies that are going to move that target, that are going to move that policymaker to take that step. The more specific you can be, the better. And I'm a big fan of writing it down, having a written plan, because when we do it kind of by the seat of our pants, it doesn't always work very well, and it's hard to sort of evaluate yourself or know whether you've succeeded or not.
And just real quick, when you talk about reporting on your 990, you report that activity when you file your 990 at the end of the year.
So there's a section of your 990 where you report your lobbying expenditures, and one of the things I would encourage folks to do, if you haven't done it already, make sure you take it's the 501H.
Cross it off my list.
501H election, because it very clearly.
Are you familiar with this?
Do folks know what that is?
Okay, great.
So if you go back to your organizations, you can talk to the person who does your 990, your finance director, your accountant, or whatever, and see if you've taken that election. But what I like about it is it gives you very clear definitions of how much you can spend, and how you spend it and how you report it, and it's much clearer because the other can be a little bit fuzzy.
It's designed to help you do it. It's
Right.
It's not meant to trap you. It's meant to support nonprofit advocacy, and it takes about 5 minutes to fill out.
Right.
So it's a great protection. Oh, I was going to mention the H election, which is just so we look for that. In fact, we act if we don't think an organization has done that, we absolutely ask and then encourage and then nudge, because it is such a safe harbor, designed to be a safe harbor for nonprofits. So that's really a great tool.
So my last question, and then we'll go to questions from the group out here. Marcia, you mentioned very briefly the assessment of this work, and if you could talk a little bit more about that, and John, talk about what that looks like for your organization. But this advocacy can be kind of this nebulous thing, so what are you looking for in some of that assessment and evaluation, and how do you make the decision to go all in long term to see some of the changes that you're looking for?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that, because here's the first thing I can tell you is that evaluating advocacy looks entirely different than evaluating direct service, and the field, and I'm talking about the nonprofit field, is really set up to help us evaluate direct services, and it is utterly inappropriate and we think actually unfair to be using the kinds of mechanisms or measures or tools that are designed for direct service work for public policy work or advocacy work. They are two entirely different beasts and should be considered as such. But it doesn't mean that there were a lot of tools. So that's why we were working with the Alliance. Now there's more. I mean, it's amazing how the field has exploded over the last decade. So there are definitely more tools. If you Google nonprofit advocacy evaluation, a whole world will open up to you. I understand that's what happens on Google. A whole world opens up to you, and you will find a lot of tools now available. But the crux of it gets to the fact that in a direct service grant term, you're typically measuring sort of units delivered to a very targeted population for a very specific purpose. I'm looking at Mary, so I mean, let's think about the food bank, right? You're going to serve 1 million people over, you know what I mean? Like it's a very specific kind of calculation. Maybe it's your hot meal program is going to serve 10,000 people over 6 months, whatever it is. But you get that. And advocacy, as Carrie was saying, you know, of course, is much more squishy. You can't determine the timeline always. Sometimes it's short, sometimes it's long. So what we now look at are a set of indicators that are actually all reflected in the advocacy evaluation tool with the Alliance for Justice. So it's what progress have you made? First of all, as to John's point, have you identified a goal? I mean, really clearly articulated a goal in mind for your advocacy target. And then we're talking about what progress have you made toward it. It may be that you reach the goal, hallelujah. Sometimes that miracle happens within a tidy period of a grant cycle. Much more often than not, it doesn't. So tell us about your progress, because interim benchmarks in the policy arena can be amazing breakthroughs and help thousands of people. I think of the Ohio Housing Trust Fund. Mm-hmm. You know, this is the state's largest investment in low-income housing. The goal was first to embed it in the state constitution, which happened. The second goal was to create a permanent funding source for it. Well, this took 10 years, 5 state budget cycles, to create a permanent, dedicated revenue source for the Ohio Housing Trust Fund, which is now at $53 million a year, and the cap just got lifted off that revenue source. So brilliant advocacy 15 years into it. But in those 5 budget cycles, each year the General Assembly invested more general revenue funds, more general revenue funds. They never would get to the holy grail of a dedicated revenue source, but they kept investing more along the way, basically guilt money. And so at one point we had T-shirts printed up that I went to Columbus and all I got was a lousy $26 million because it was an awesome interim, you know, in my world of evaluation, that was quite an interim benchmark. Did they achieve? So if you were looking at it in the black and white sense of a direct service grant, the goal wasn't achieved. And it's like, are you kidding? Yes, they didn't get a dedicated revenue stream, but there was remarkable success that was, it would have been wholly unfair to say that that grant period was a failure when they made such incredible interim progress that benefited tens of thousands of people in Greater Cleveland. And so interim benchmarks, you know, so what could you see as potential progress along the way are really important. One of the other big things is, and this again reflects something John said, what relationships have you built along the way, both with your partners in crime, I mean, so your likely allies, and are you building out the circle of engagement in terms of your advocacy partnerships, but also what relationships are you building along the way with people that can make the decision you want made? Are you starting to have relationship with key members of the General Assembly, with key staff, with governors or executive branch officials? So are you building the network of support that's going to get you that next step closer along the way? And so those are, and there's more, but those are 2 big ones.
And John, as you answer this question, if you could talk some of the specifics about how you track it and some of those details about how you're able to do this as track this kind of information as an organization.
Well, I mean, some of it's actually pretty simple. I mean, just sort of keeping track of it. But I think, you know, I mean, things I'd think about, you know, reporting on, as Marcia said, the relationships developed. So the meetings held, who you met with, have you met with key folks? If I was a funder, I'd want to report on the fact that I'd done it in a bipartisan way. That I sort of had, it wouldn't help if I had all my relationships around one side of the aisle and none on the other, because particularly if it was on the side of the aisle that's not in power. Because then you know that you're never going to get anywhere. You're not going to advance your policy unless you show a bipartisan connection. To speaking to Marcia's point, if there were, to the extent that I've been able to bring others to the table, other organizations, to get them engaged in this issue as well. I mean, around the Housing Trust Fund, a lot of organizations, came to be involved in that. So I'd want to be able to report on that. I'd want to be able to report on the fact on how other organizations were using our materials. Were they incorporating that in their testimony? Were they, using that in sharing that with their constituencies, with their members? I'd want to know, to the extent that, if we'd formed a coalition around something, were people fully participating in that? What was the participation like? Were people taking on responsibility? So I'd want to be able to show that that there was broad support for what we were trying to do, and that we'd been able to grow that. And as Marcia said, it kind of grows over time. I mean, I think that's the one thing, that I think has been really positive about. And the other thing I got to say too is, I mean, the foundations in Cleveland are kind of like superstars compared to the rest of the state in terms of investing in advocacy. I mean, we are really lucky, and I serve on the board of the St. Luke's Foundation. We invest in advocacy as well, but it's not like that around the rest of the state, and that's part of the unfortunate part. I think if we get more foundations to act like the ones do here in Cleveland, I think we could make a lot more progress. But I think you've got to be able to show, here are the results, and having a good plan at the beginning makes it easier to report on what you've done, because you actually wrote out what you were going to do.
But a good plan is a short plan.
Yes, and a short proposal.
But I wanted to mention another, really briefly, but an incredibly important thing we look at is, how is the organization internally reflecting its commitment? So is their senior management engaged in this? Is there perhaps a board committee that is overseeing this work? Is there a board resolution that reflects the priority that's being presented or promoted as the advocacy goal? Is there a staff person who has a percentage of time? And trust me, I realize all of these things aren't that easy, but it's not that it has to be your 50% of your executive director's time, but you have to be able to demonstrate that this isn't a fly-by-night thing that one person on staff thinks is a good idea, but rather reflects a organizational commitment. Doesn't mean that it takes a tremendous amount of resources, but that there's a genuine organizational commitment behind what this effort is that reflects its priority to the organization's mission and goals. So that's really critical.